Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you um, about fellowship in the AIA. I've made quite a few presentations about how to put together a fellowship submittal, usually with a few overarching principles and quite a bit of step-by-step instruction. I'm going to reverse that emphasis today. The AIA Fellowship webpage, this is the URL, but it's easier just to search for AIA Fellowship. It'll pop right up. It's gotten better in recent years. It has all the step-by-step stuff, as well as a lot of other valuable resources. And the details change from year to year. Including potentially things that if you do them incorrectly could get you disqualified. There aren't a lot of those things, but you should be aware of them. So I urge you to study the material that the AIA provides for the cycle that you're applying in. If you're submitting this year, it'll be for what's called the class of 2026, because it's the group that will be elevated at the 2026 AIA convention. That material hasn't been, the material for that cycle hasn't been posted yet. What you'll find on the AIA site right now is for the most recent cycle for the people who are going to be invested in Boston in a few weeks at the national convention. So my emphasis today is on the qualities that fellowship honors and therefore encourages. I'd like you to think of fellowship not just as an honor, but also as a model for professional development, one that encourages architects to master an area of expertise and share that expertise broadly with the profession. So I'm going to outline some principles for crafting a compelling fellowship submittal. And as I go along, I'll try to show how those principles can be applied to your practice so that whenever you or one of your colleagues decides to apply for fellowship, you'll be in a good position to do so. But more importantly, I hope I'll convince you that you'll benefit from these principles even if you have no interest ever in becoming a fellow. Before we go any further, I'll mention the first principle. A fellowship submittal is a lot of work. It takes time and resources, your own, your staff perhaps, others whom you enlist. It's a project, and it's best for you to treat it as a project. Now, a little context here. The AIA says that about 3% of the architect members, that is the licensed members of the Institute, are fellows. But that percentage isn't evenly distributed across the country or even at the state level. AIA California very kindly provided me the numbers of architect members and fellows for each of our 21 local chapters in the state. And here's part of what I discovered. So 3% of architect members of AIA National are fellows, 8% of architect members of AIA California are. In the San Francisco chapter, it's 14%, LA's 11, Redwood Empire's 9, San Diego's 8, AIA East Bay is 7. Santa Barbara and Monterey Bay also have 7, and goes down from there. Inland California is the only chapter without any fellows. Why the differences? So my first thought was, well, San Francisco and LA have a lot of big architecture firms with a lot of resources, both to promote the advancement of individual members of their staff and to put together submittals. But then what about Redwood Empire? I'm not sure. Honestly, I have no idea. But my hypothesis is that in addition to the presence of big firms with big resources, certain settings may provide better models for sharing, more opportunities to share locally, greater connectedness somehow to enable people to share more broadly. Perhaps chapters that provide more of these things can help promote an ecosystem of fellowship. And that's something I would love to talk more about at some point. But I emphasize sharing because the gist of fellowship is precisely that. We'll circle back to this point, but first, let's look at a more formal description. The express purpose of fellowship is to honor significant accomplishment and influence on the profession. It's crucial to understand these two criteria and to understand that they're equally important. It's not just about accomplishment. You also have to have been influential within the profession, not not having influenced society or your clients or the urban realm, although of course those are things you do. But fellowship recognizes and encourages influence on the profession of architecture. Therefore, probably the most important principle is that a successful nomination depends on demonstrating influence. If you're influential, the accomplishment's going to be there, but it's not necessarily true the other way around. Now, for many of us, the idea of becoming influential can seem daunting or even spurious. Some may think it's a distraction from the work, ego wrongly invested. It may feel especially so with the explosion of influencers on the internet. I'd like to argue, though, that it can be much more congenial and virtuous thing even. And here's maybe a way to think about it. It's easier, perhaps, to embrace the idea of influence if you think of it as sharing. Rather than promoting your persona or your brand, think of it as sharing your expertise. So don't ask, how have I been influential? Just ask, how have I shared? Implicitly, the fellowship program is meant to encourage architects to do this, to engage in fellowship with one another, just the way the Concrete Masonry Awards encourage architects to use concrete masonry. It becomes explicit at the investiture ceremony when the chancellor of the College of Fellows always emphasizes that becoming a fellow is not a conclusion. It's a stepping stone to even greater contributions to the profession. We'll talk about more effective ways of sharing as we go along, but first, let's look at what counts as significant accomplishment. Your fellowship submittal can only tell one story. Doing that can be challenging since architecture is such a multi-headed beast, right? But fellowship doesn't typically honor the well-rounded architect. The closest it comes to that is under the design category. If we assume that design is the summation of all that we do, and I think it is, and if we assume that the evidence for that, design awards and publications, adequately capture that totality, which they may or they may not. Design is only one of now 6 categories in which you can submit for fellowship. They call these categories objects. I used to think that was an odd choice of words, but it makes sense to me if you think that a synonym of object is a goal, right? A goal, um, which reinforces the notion that fellowship is meant not just to honor contributions, but to encourage them, to encourage us to set goals. These are the objects described roughly the way you'll find them on the AIA website, except for number 4. Its description is a little bit vague, its formal description, but what it amounts to practically is campus architects, people who are in charge of capital programs for an organization like Kaiser Permanente or a government agency like the GSA, that sort of folks, architects who hire architects. Most architects do at least a couple of these things, right? You design buildings and you manage a practice, or you lead the AIA and you manage a practice. But for fellowship, for the submittal, you have to pick one. The jury expects to see a robust case for a single body of focused work. If you try to present two, you're inevitably going to underrepresent each of them. And you raise the suspicion that either of them by itself would not have been robust enough. So how do you pick? It can be hard. Here's maybe one way to think about it. Let's say that this scatter of dots represents your professional accomplishments. And if you squint at it a little bit, like I don't know how you would come up with this, but just as an analogy, if you squint at it, you see, well, maybe there's a sort of through line there, something that connects those dots. Maybe they're all of a particular building type. Maybe they're all sports facilities. Now you'll see there are a couple of outliers here. Let's say the one at the top is something really cool you did for the AIA. And let's say the one at the bottom is some important public service that you performed. And maybe those things are both really wonderful, but they're not going to be part of your story, your fellowship story. They'll appear in section 2 of the submittal, which is a sort of expanded curriculum vitae, but they won't be in the core narrative because they would just distract from the story about the sports facilities. Now, it might happen that you did a bunch of cool things for the AIA. Maybe they're not as numerous as the sports facilities, but maybe they're more cohesive. Maybe the evidence of their influence on the profession is greater. And in that case, they would probably be your story. So it could be that one or that one. Those are two options. There's a third possibility. Let's say that as you thought about it, you recognize that the things you did for the AIA all had something to do with developing guidelines and practices for integrated project delivery. And then you remembered that a number of your sports facilities were delivered through that method. So thinking about it that way brings these two stories together and they become one story. Now, it could be that when you think about all of your accomplishments, there are a couple of stories that feel like they're equally weighted. They have similar evidence of influence. They're similarly, the examples are similarly numerous and compelling. So you just have to pick. You can pick this one, you can pick that one. It doesn't really matter because when you become a fellow, once you become a fellow, nobody cares. Honest to goodness, they don't care what object you got it in, what you got it for. They may make assumptions based on what they know about you, but it's all good. So don't sweat that. Do the one that's easiest to demonstrate. It may not be the one you love the most, may not be the one that's most important to you, but it's the one again, to use the word share, it's the one it's easiest for you to share its significance and its influence. As you identify this object, I have to catch up with myself here in the notes. You're doing something that's essential for fellowship, making that choice. But it also can be valuable for your individual professional development and the advancement of your practice. To do this from time to time, whether you're applying for fellowship or not. Quite a few years ago, a big, significant San Francisco architecture firm brought in a consultant, wasn't me, to help them clarify, rethink their brand. And the first thing this consultant did was to find the top line statement that each of 8 or 10 of this firm's competitors made on their websites, gathered them up along with the firm's own statement, put them all on a slide, and showed it to the firm's principals and asked them to pick out theirs. Well, they couldn't do it. Of course, they couldn't do it because they all sounded the same. Generalities aren't compelling. They're not even informative. Tangible, vivid specifics are. You can't tell everybody everything about your firm. But if you tell someone something concrete that you excel at, that matters to them, well, then you're getting somewhere. When you define in that way, more specifically, some area in which you excel, what you're doing is you're identifying an expertise. I don't know if you know the little book that Art Gensler wrote called Art's Principles, but I highly recommend it. And at one point in it, he says, expertise closes deals. So being able to articulate your areas of expertise in concrete ways is just simply good for business. And it's essential for fellowship because fellowship is not granted for a collection of unrelated accomplishments. 3 things you did for the AIA, 4 buildings, 2 public service projects. It's granted for accomplishments that add up to a bigger story, which is to say it's granted for expertise. I like to show a couple of pictures. Always, we like to look at pictures, and I like showing these, which are a couple of projects by Hornberger Worstel. You may know this San Francisco firm. The one on the left is a resort hotel, I think in Texas, maybe, and the one on the right is a private school down near Monterey. Each has this element of an outdoor fireplace with a gigantic chimney. The chimney gathers the landscape, acts at the big scale, and the fireplace is a cozy little place for a few people to gather. In the hospitality realm, which is one of Hornberger Worstel's areas of expertise, it's particularly important, I think, to be able to build relationships between that grand scale and the intimate scale. And so this is just one concrete example of design expertise. So this notion of expertise, I mentioned this because I want to say, when we use the word expertise, we might tend to think of, a specialty in like the design of curtain walls, and that would be an example of something that might be your fellowship submittal story. But even within the design category, being able to draw a thread among the projects is a very valuable thing to do. And what I want to say is that it's valuable amidst the hustle of day-to-day practice to find moments, make moments to reflect, to ask yourself, what am I particularly good at? What would I like to be better at? What do I particularly care about and want to become better at? And if you do that regularly, your expertise will deepen, your practice will flourish, and incidentally, you'll become well positioned to apply for fellowship. I'll also mention that the jury recommends that the exhibits that you put together, the third section of your submittal, to support your story, be organized to identify a challenge you faced, how you responded to that challenge, and what the outcomes were. And this is also a useful framework for self-reflection as well, because it identifies issues that you are engaged with. It clarifies your expertise, that is, what you do, how you respond. And it measures, or at least assesses, results. Now, here's the really cool part. Sharing your expertise increases your expertise, because the best way to master something is to teach it. And cyclically, as your expertise grows, so will the opportunities to share it, because people will ask you to. They'll ask you to give a talk. They'll invite you to write something or to uh, join a commission. And, they'll probably ask you to design some more buildings. When a noted architect speaks at an architecture school, they're not just giving back, although they are doing that, and that's important. But they're also clarifying for themselves where they've been and where they're going. So it's a cycle, a virtuous cycle. In my experience, sharing expertise, as I'm doing now, is much easier than pitching services. Have never been good at selling services. Some people are, and that's great. I'm not. But sharing my expertise is much easier. It's material I'm comfortable with and confident in. I know its value. I can see fairly quickly how it might help a particular person in a particular situation. I'm not trying to sell somebody something they don't want. I'm offering possibilities. And that's from the marketing perspective. But from the influencing the profession perspective, it's even easier because there you're talking about things you're interested in with other people who are also interested in those things. It's fun, it's enriching, it's engaging. Now, here's a crucial distinction. What happens frequently, I think, in architecture firms is that an architect designs a project, the marketing director packages it and pitches it to a magazine. If the magazine accepts it, the marketing director handles any questions, photo credits, all of that. The article gets published, and that's an end to it. That's pitching. It's one directional. But if you're thinking in terms of sharing, what you really want would be to develop a relationship between the author of the work, the architect, and the editor, so that a conversation begins. And ultimately, what you really want to have happen is for the editor, when she thinks of a topic that she wants to have an article about, she thinks of you and she asks you, right? It's a continuing conversation. It's a good discipline for business development to think in these terms, because it reminds us that listening is as important, maybe more important, than speaking. So I encourage you to think of every act of sharing this way. You're not pitching information at somebody, you're inviting a conversation. Now, here's for a lot of us, one of the more difficult principles. Architecture is a team sport, but the fellowship submittal or fellowship is an individual honor. Architecture is a team sport, but each member of the team contributes something distinctive. And the submittal is not about what your team did. It's about what you contributed to whatever got done. It's valuable in your practice to reflect from time to time on what exactly you've contributed individually. It's good for your professional advancement, clarifies what your firm expects from you, what you expect from your firm. Um, Helps you identify things you need to work on, people you might connect with to learn those things, resources that can help propel you. So when you do that, you become stronger. You may be doing that in some broad personal ways, but you'll also be doing that in your areas of expertise. And when you do that in an area of expertise, you become your superhero self. And and this is the self you want to present in a fellowship submittal. You don't want to be shy. You can't be shy. Um, for some of us, this is very hard. But there is one convention of the submittal that makes it a little easier. The convention is that you write it in the third person. You say, Tim did such and such, rather than I did such and such. There's this sort of fiction that someone else is nominating you, someone else is writing about you. Maybe back in the day that actually happened. It doesn't. Now you're really doing it yourself. I mean, you can enlist help, of course, but you need to present this this version of yourself, the one that's a lot like you, but a little better looking, right? There are a few people who don't need encouragement on this front, but for most of us, it's good practice again to do this um, from time to time, just in our work life, right? To really give ourselves some credit, write it down, what I'm good at, what I'm getting to be good at, what I'm proud of. We don't get probably enough pats on the back in this business or in any business. This is the best advice anybody ever gave me on fellowship submittals. I wish I remember who said it. Um, but here's why. When all the submittals have been received and the AIA staff have vetted them for adherence to the rules, they divvy them up among the jurors. There used to be 7 jurors, there are 11 now. Historically, there have been about 300 submittals, so maybe every juror gets 30-ish submittals, something like that. And they have a couple of months to study them. And then the jury meets and they take turns presenting the ones they're responsible for. So your assigned juror is presenting your case, and you want to make it easy for the juror to present your case effectively. So what you're going to do is you're going to tell your story repeatedly and consistently. There's a 35-word statement that begins it that is what will be read when you walk across the stage to get your medal. You'll tell the story in that. Then you'll tell it in this one-page summary. You'll tell it again in section 2, which is the expanded curriculum vitae, and you'll tell it again in section 3 through the exhibits that provide evidence, more expanded evidence. And each time you'll tell it as best you can in the same terms, in the same order, the same story. So it's a script. Your submittal is a script. It's also a great way to organize your marketing materials like that. But I want to emphasize that you can't simply take your marketing materials and drop them into the submittal because they're going to be about your firm. And remember, the submittal is about you. For the submittal, you can't just assert that you've done things or that those things have been influential. You have to provide evidence. The most common evidence of influence is publications and awards, speaking engagements, those kinds of things. There can be many, many forms of evidence of influence, and on the on the web page, the fellowship web page, you'll see reference to the idea of a ripple effect. Basically means something that's not as obvious, but you need to trace it out. But it's important to understand that the jury of fellows is not in the business of identifying previously unrecognized accomplishment. They aren't a design awards jury. They aren't a jury in that sense. They don't have the time. If you have 300 submittals and you give them each 7 minutes, do the math, it comes out to 35 hours. No breaks, no food, 35 hours. And so they do not have time to assess the quality of all the stuff in all of these submittals. And the individual juror who's responsible for presenting a portion of the submittals doesn't want to and shouldn't take that responsibility on him or herself. So what the jury's looking for is evidence that authoritative bodies, design awards programs, uh, editors, whatever, have already assessed the work and have already judged it to be good. And it astounds me how often even highly successful, well-organized firms fail to keep track of the evidence that will support a fellowship submittal, even for a partner. It's just nuts. You want to make that kind of record keeping a part of your everyday practice. And again, not just for an eventual fellowship submittal, but because there's gold in there. Treat your accomplishments not as history to be filed away, but as platforms for advancement. Think of a resume not just as a list of your accomplishments, but also as a directory of the people who helped you accomplish them. So when you note down an article that was published about your work, make a note of the editor, right? Make a note of all those people. Return to that material. Refresh those relationships because you want continuing conversations. And keeping track of those people is going to be helpful. It'll serve you well when it comes to demonstrating influence. The jury is looking for broad influence, ideally nationally, but certainly broader than locally. So you need to take every opportunity to underscore the breadth of sharing that you've done, your geographical reach, let's say. And that includes, importantly, your choice of sponsor and recommenders. Each nominee has a sponsor who's a fellow who encourages you, critiques you. And the first time around, you get 7 letters of recommendation. So if you're applying from the East Bay, you might imagine that a map of your sponsor and recommenders might look like this. But actually, what it really should look like is this. Having the recommenders scattered all over the country doesn't prove that you've had widespread influence, but not having them spread out all over the country suggests that you have not. So this is really what you want. And, you know, you can take the prospect of fellowship then as an encouragement to reach beyond your local area as you develop the conversations that propel your thinking. And that itself is beneficial because every place, even a seemingly cosmopolitan place, is parochial in some ways. And it's always good to step outside the familiar. Just a couple more. Getting by isn't good enough. You can't approach this with a can I get by with this attitude. If you find yourself thinking that way at all often as you're putting together a submittal, you're not ready. And here's one that it took me a while to discover because it didn't come up until it came up. But look for gaps in your story. There are going to be gaps. There are recessions. You take time off when a child is born or a parent is failing. But don't leave the gaps unexplained. I had a client a few years ago who managed huge projects, important projects internationally for over 20 years for big firms. But in the midst of that, um, he took a few years off when his children were young because he didn't want to be out of the country all the time when his children were young, right? It didn't occur to either of us in the submittal to um, say anything about those years because the work before and after was so impressive. But the submittal got kicked back. And the question was, what happened between 1993 and 1998? And you can imagine what the jury might have been thinking. Was his license suspended? Did he go to jail? Of course, they didn't ask those things explicitly, but they wanted to know what happened in there. So ask yourself, explain gaps, and also ask yourself, what questions does this narrative raise but fails to answer? Or better, get a friend to read it. And if questions occur to them, um, try to put those questions to rest because you don't want um, a submittal to come back to you because a juror had a question that might not even have been relevant. You don't want to have to resubmit because of that. And again, it's good to ask in the midst of your practice, what are the gaps in your expertise? Um, who might you talk to begin to fill them in? What resources might you look for? Now, this isn't really a principle, but I want to emphasize it because it's a sad fact that your colleagues to the east of you have up to 3 more hours to prepare their submittal. This is an online process now. AIA is headquartered in DC, as you know. And at 5 p.m. or whatever time it says for the current cycle, whatever it says at that time, Eastern time, they're going to close that portal and there are no exceptions. Sometimes life isn't fair. Now, with this slide, I almost did one other thing that you should not do in your submittal, and that is don't end with a whimper. Don't end on a minor point. At the end of your section 1 summary in which you've compellingly described your work in integrated project delivery and its widespread influence on the profession, don't tag on, and for 10 years, she served as a mentor to community college students. Avoid that nagging impulse. It's always there to try to pull in those outliers. Stay focused, stay strong. That's what I have to say, and I'm happy to take questions.
I have a question. First of all, thank you for this. This was really great. I really liked your presentation, so thank you very much, Tim.
Thank
Um,
you.
my question is about, I mean, how how hard is it to do this? Do people often try multiple times, or um, that was really it, like whether or
Yeah.
not this is a process that you should try to keep at, be
Yeah.
persistent.
Yes, it is. It's very common to have to submit twice. Um, you know, often there'll be something that comes up, like that example about the guy who took the time off that you wouldn't have thought about. Um, and they'll want to know more. There is good feedback typically. If you submit and aren't successful, you'll get an invitation to speak with a member of the honors and awards staff, and they'll have notes from the jury that will, spell out the things that they would like to see that they didn't see. And it's always good to resubmit. But, at the same time, one reason I try to emphasize the benefit that this process might be to your practice or to you personally is that whenever you're doing something like this that's not a sure thing, it's really a good idea to have an ulterior benefit from it, right? Um, you do get a little bit of advantage the second time around, both because have, they've identified things that they want you to improve in your submittal, but also because you get three more recommenders. The first time you submit, you have seven. Five of those have to be AIA members. Two of them could be clients or other people. The second time, the additional three can be anybody, so it broadens the pool. If you have to submit a third time, you get three more. Um, Once you've done it three times in a row, they ask you to take a year off before you try again. But you would be surprised at some of the people who had to do it twice. People you would think, oh, they would be a sure thing, but it's pretty rigorous and there can be unexpected things. So yeah, it's worth just taking it. If you don't get it the first time, just take a deep breath. Don't get all upset. Give it another shot.
Great. Thanks for your advice.
Sure. Other questions or thoughts?
Tim, I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you. I can even see you.
Oh my God, that's frightening. Um, so hi. Um, Thank you for the presentation. I think those words were deeply felt and founded in your range of experience and not only dealing with individual fellowship applications, but different firms of different sizes. And I was wondering, I mean, as you were speaking, I thought this is profound advice for building a strong professional practice and engaging with your staff members and making sure that you're being a good steward as a office leader for them in their own professional development. And I was wondering if you might talk a little bit, or if you had any thoughts about engaging with professional practices, not so much just the individuals that are identified and interested in seeking fellowship because they're at that point of accomplishment, but young folks that are starting in the profession and really haven't necessarily found their way yet. And I was thinking about, market leaders, marketing folks. This is just a different way of thinking about things as opposed to, trying to promote and trying to sell and trying to win the next job, which is often, the focus of a lot of the activity in a practice. But I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about building competencies and supporting your staff members and how firm leaders ought to be thinking about engaging around that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I can do that any more eloquently than you just did, Greg, but yeah, it's a real interest. I mean, I've worked on a lot of fellowship submittals over the years with people, but almost always um, people think about fellowship when when a colleague suggests that they ought to apply for it, right? People aren't thinking about it long in advance, and also people aren't, I think, typically thinking of it as offering a model for professional development, and that really has come to interest me a great deal. And I would welcome the opportunity to talk with firm leaders about that, to talk with AIA chapter leaders about that, about how a chapter might help to cultivate. I think I used the word ecosystem before, or culture, however you'd like to think of it, um, of sharing of expertise. I think it enriches the profession. It enriches an individual practice. It enriches the individual, and then the fellowship thing becomes, just kind of a natural outgrowth of that. It's not necessarily the point. The point is really making that rich culture of knowledge sharing. And thank you for that question. Thank you for both of those questions. Are there others? Um, well, um, let me just see if I can run back up to the top here. There's my email. If anybody has questions afterwards, I'm happy to field them. And if not, I guess I would turn this back over to Sydney or Mike uh, if they're there.
I'm here, Tim. I
Yeah,
just want to say, thank you so much for this presentation and thank you for everyone who attended. We will have the recording of this up on our YouTube channel, most likely by the end of today. So if there's any pieces that you missed or you want to review, that'll be available for you.
yeah, and I just want to thank Sydney especially for her help with this. I'm a codger and I've not um, done a formal presentation on Zoom before. I've been on Zoom meetings and so on, but Sydney, you've been tremendously helpful and made me feel comfortable with this, and I truly appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate hearing that. All right. Have a great day, everyone. We hope to see you at an upcoming event. Bye.
Righty. Bye-bye.